Well, those of you who know Schreiner University, we're a small school with very small class sizes, so I'm not used to speaking with a microphone. It's been a while, so tell me if I'm too loud. Remind me if I get off camera. I'll try and stay here. Um, well, and I want to thank Kim Ort for inviting me to do this, who is not here, but she audited one of my classes at Schreiner, an entomology class. And for those of you who are interested, you can do that too. There's a minimal fee involved, but it's not much. And there's a variety of courses that some of you might be interested in. I'd certainly welcome any of you in entomology or invertebrate zoology. I'm actually in invertebrate zoology class right now. I let my students go early. They thank you. Um, for some reason, I got a night class on that one. Anyway, so yeah, Odonata are my specialty. That's what I did my dissertation work on. It's what I continue to do work on. And I don't know exactly what a Texas master naturalist knows about dragonflies and damselflies. So pardon me if I'm too basic. I'm going to go through a little bit of basic biology and then tell you more about my research and what I've been working on here in the Hill Country. And, I've seen this logo a million times, but I had to look up what it was because I didn't really know. I just knew it was some kind of a darner. How many of you knew that this is the species of darner that's on the logo? Yeah, now you know. And, frankly, it's beautiful, and there are reasons why you pick logos based on the way they look and all that. I don't know personally if I would have picked this species as representative of Texas master naturalist, but I don't know. It is in Texas. It works. It's in a lot of other states. That's the problem. There are some that are a little bit more charismatic and uniquely Texan, I would say. Um. Anyway, so okay, now we're going to get into the hardcore science. No, this is just a quick overview. What are insects? I assume you all know that. We would say variously they're the class Hexapoda, and Odonata are a order within many other orders that are things that we call insect that's down here, and we would say this is near the base of the tree in terms of insect diversity. There are a few other orders that are more primitive and that we would assume evolved long before dragonflies, but these are things that mostly don't have wings. Some people don't even really consider them insects. And then you have mayflies down there as perhaps what we agree on today is the most primitive winged insects. And then Odonata is right there, sister to all the other insects. And the level of order is a taxonomic rank. It includes things like beetles and grasshoppers and uh, praying mantises. Those are all their own orders. So Odonata is the order that includes both dragonflies and damselflies. Um, and these are broken down into two suborders, which are very distinct in terms of their evolutionary history. I would say they're perhaps not so distinct in terms of how you tell the difference between them in terms of their biology, because they're actually quite similar. But we do call those two different suborders. So all the dragonflies are in the Anisoptera. Dragonflies are damselflies are what we call Zygoptera. Did I just say that backwards? Dragonflies, Anisoptera. Damselflies, Zygoptera. Worldwide, there's only about 5,000 species of these animals, between 5 and 6,000. These are all broad estimates. We know there's more out there we haven't discovered. Sometimes we say things that we once thought were species no longer are. Rough estimate, 5 to 6,000 species. And for insects, that's not a lot at all. Beetles have 300,000-400,000 described species. Butterflies and moths, almost 200,000 described species. So 5,000 species is a very small order, but keep in mind that they were among the first insects to evolve, and they've been around largely unchanged for over 300 million years. So even though their diversity perhaps isn't very successful, I would say biologically, their life forms, their ecologies are all very successful. They do have entirely aquatic larvae. I'm sure many of you know that. They're juvenile forms, which you could say are larvae or sometimes nymphs. I use the words interchangeably personally. They live in the water and they spend, most of their lives in that juvenile stage, like most insects do. And then in the adult form, they emerge from the water and they tend to stay relatively close to water throughout their lives because that's where a lot of their food is and that's where they like to find their mates and lay their eggs and all that. In all stages of life, well, except the egg, they are predators. So the larvae are predators of anything that's small and moving in the water. And then the adults are predators of anything that's roughly their size or smaller, maybe sometimes a little bit bigger. And so mostly we're talking about other insects. Now, I will say right off the bat, you will hear a lot of things about, well, don't they eat mosquitoes and aren't they important for controlling mosquito populations? Certainly, yes, but they also eat a lot of things that are not mosquitoes as well. And they obviously don't eat mosquitoes enough to make mosquitoes not a problem for humans. But just keep in mind, it could be worse if dragonflies weren't around. There's been some attempts to study them and figure out, can we do something more for dragonflies and damselflies to get them to control mosquitoes even more and even better. So far, the population dynamics don't really work out. There's way more mosquitoes than there are dragonflies to eat them. So, but maybe someday. They've got a lot of other interesting, unique biology that I'll talk about. And I'm just going to show you a random, very small sampling of some pictures as I go through this. But one of the things that got me interested, well, two things got me interested in these. First of all, I did my undergraduate degree, which you didn't mention. Sorry for you Aggies, at UT. And when I was at UT, I had a great entomology professor named John Abbott. If you are familiar with insect biology and insect photography in this country, you probably know the name John Abbott. If not, if you want to get into it, you'll find he was a professor at UT. He's since moved on to University of Alabama, but he inspired me. I did undergraduate research projects with him. He was the best professor I ever had. And he is an expert on these things and got me super excited about them. The other thing that got me interested and thinking about studying them more when I went to graduate school was just their weird reproductive biology. So I'll talk about that a little bit. But here you see various aspects of their reproductive biology, including pictures like this on the left, which are a common sight to see around here, especially in late summer. But it's one of my favorite things to see, which is a huge group of, in this case, damselflies. This is a species, Argia moesta, one of the most common damselflies you'll see around here, and in fact, in the entire country. And there's just this huge group of them all simultaneously laying their eggs in this piece of wet driftwood. This is in the Guadalupe River. A little bit further downstream is where I took this photo. And so what these things do, among other things that are fascinating, is lay their eggs in things like this. And this driftwood very likely is not going to stay there when the eggs hatch. And so I'm going to come back to this when I talk more about my research. This is a very important part of my research, is how does the movement of a thing like this relate to the movement of the overall genetics of these species, and how might that relate into keeping species together or populations together versus, if you remember, classic natural selection and reproductive isolation, which is what leads to forming new species. I'll tell you a little bit more about their reproduction here in a minute. Here's some just random images that I found of their juvenile stages, in which they are almost entirely aquatic. Some people might argue that something like this is semi-aquatic or even terrestrial. There are a few species in very moist tropical habitats, like this one is in Hawaii, where they aren't directly in water their whole entire lives, but the air is so saturated with moisture that it's effectively like being in water, and it's very rare. Most of them are truly aquatic. Keep in mind that when they're in the water, they are also food for a lot of other aquatic species, fish, amphibians, reptiles, things like that. The larvae are fascinating for a variety of reasons, but in my opinion, a lot harder to identify, at least at the species level. So I don't work with them a lot. I'll show you in a second some of the differences between between dragonflies and damselflies. These here are all, in this figure, dragonflies. This one's a damselfly. Notice any major differences before I tell you? The legs. Now the difference in the leg length can depend on the biology of the species, and that is true for both damselflies and dragonflies. But I heard the tail. So this is a damselfly, and what they have is, at the tail region, what you would call is 3 feather-like gills that extend beyond the end of the abdomen. Dragonflies, which you see you might see some little bumps coming off the end, but those are not the same thing. And like this one doesn't have anything. They actually have something like this structure, but it's just internal in their body right there, which in that region basically is their rectum. So they can pull water in and extract oxygen from inside the tissue that's inside of their rectum. With damselflies, they do that externally. By the way, that's not the only way that they obtain oxygen. They can actually obtain oxygen through their body wall and the soft parts of their cuticle. It's diffusion, if you remember that from college, whenever that was. Here you see just a cartoon of the life cycle. So these animals, unlike beetles and moths, they don't go through a pupa stage. They simply have the juvenile stage in which they'll go through a series of molts. And then their last juvenile stage, the body is transforming inside that exoskeleton that they have, and they simply emerge from there as a fully formed adult. In biology and in entomology in particular, an adult means you have wings, and then you have mature sexual structures. So when you see things with wings, you know it's an adult. And so the dragonflies and damselflies that you think of when you're not thinking of the larvae are adults. And so then to complete the life cycle for these kinds of animals, they are sexually reproducing, they have to have sex. And that's one of the things about their biology that is absolutely fascinating to me and completely different from other insects, although there are some other arthropods that kind of sort of do what they do. So here's the gist of that. The male, I'm going to focus on this image that I just got off the web. That's a very nice image. The male is the bright blue one, and the female is the one that's here in the sort of darker blue or more drab blue. The male has a structure on the second part of its abdomen, which it uses to transfer sperm to the female. However, it's very far away from the body part that actually produces the sperm, which is testes, which are down near the very back of the abdomen. Sorry, whoops. Trying to get this mouse so that it records my pointer. Okay, so the sperm is released from the end of the abdomen, which is where it is in most insects. And before he grafts the female, he transfers that to this structure on the second segment of his abdomen prior to engaging with the female. Then he grabs the female by the back. In the case of damselfly, it's by the back, the segments of the thorax right behind the head. In dragonflies, they actually grab the head of the female. And then she moves her abdomen around. The end of her abdomen is where her genital openings are and makes contact with that secondary genital structure of the male, forming this unique position. We call it the wheel position. Everybody says it looks kind of like a heart if you look sideways a little bit. These animals aren't making love in the sense that humans are, as far as we can tell. We can't get inside their brains, but they are certainly copulating. And so the male's transferring sperm to the female, and this is interesting for a variety of reasons. First, we call it indirect sperm transfer. It is common throughout invertebrates that happens. Many animals reproduce by releasing the sperm and the egg into the environment, for example. And many other arthropods, which are animals that are closely related to insects, but not, think about spiders and things like that, will have indirect sperm transfer where the males will release a sperm packet and then somehow present it to the female, either directly with their legs or leave it on the ground in front of her. And so this looks like a kind of a remnant to an evolutionary history that they share with other arthropods that are not insects. We don't know that for sure, but it certainly makes logical sense that that's what that is. The other thing is that depending on the species of odonate that we're talking about, there may be various things that happen prior to this direct copulation process. Behavioral courtships, there may be things in which males are guarding territories that are suitable for the females, but they certainly don't all do that. But there has to be some kind of mutual recognition and agreeing to this process. The females, even though they're grasped by the males, have to at least present her abdomen up to complete the process. And they don't always do that. So we know from studies that males can't necessarily, in this kind of animal, in this kind of insect, can't necessarily tell the difference between females of their own species and other very similar species. By the way, I can't either. Some of them are really hard to identify, especially when they're females. The females don't look as colorful and don't have some of the easy to identify structures that males do. So they'll attempt to mate with her, but she has to know that that it's the right species. And all of our evidence suggests that she can somehow tell by the way that she's being grasped by the male that it's a male of the right species. And that was a topic of my dissertation, was looking at some of that structure and seeing, well, how different really are they when they're very similar but not the same species. And well, it was inconclusive, but it was fascinating. I got to play with CAT scanners and look at the genital structures of damselflies through a CAT scan device. It was wonderful. You will sometimes see them in flight while they're doing this behavior, by the way, and that makes them easier to observe. They slow down a little bit when they're flying around in wheel position in copula. And as I showed you on this picture here, I know it's kind of hard to see, but I was trying to capture how many of them there are. But in this case, for Argia, the males will often remain grasping the females while she lays eggs. So anybody have any ideas about why they might do that? Why would the male continue to make contact with her while she's laying eggs? So that they can do it again right afterwards? It's a good guess. They eat them. Well, some insects do that apparently. To my knowledge, no, they're not doing that, although they certainly could. And they do have cannibalism in this group of insects, as most insects do. Again, if it's their size or smaller, they'll probably eat it if they're hungry enough. What do you got? So another male can't come in before they fertilize the eggs. Yeah, that really is the answer. So good one. Insects, when they transfer sperm from a male to a female, that doesn't automatically result in fertilization like it does in many animals, including mammals and things like that. And so females are able to store the sperm from a mating in a separate chamber of their body internally, and fertilization happens as she lays the egg. So it could be sometime later after copulation. And there's a potential for her to mate with multiple males and have the sperm of multiple males stored in these chambers of her body before she lays the eggs. So in that case, it would reduce the potential for any single male to be the father of the offspring. And so we think that these males that do this, that sort of guard the female while she's laying eggs, it's a way of guaranteeing, or at least greatly increasing, the chances that those are his sperm that are fertilizing the eggs. And, if you think about evolution and what's the meaning of life from an evolutionary biology perspective, it is passing on your genes. And so anything that might reduce that, we think evolution might try and find a way out of that. There are other species, and by the way, not all dragonflies and damselflies do this by any stretch. Some of them have other tricks up their sleeve, or up their penises, I should say. Some of them can block up the ducts that the female uses to store the sperm, and then other species have the ability to go in there with their penis and scoop it out, the sperm of a previous male competitor. But it really depends on what family or what genus of damselfly or dragonfly you're talking about. They don't all do all these things. Let's see, where else was I going with this? Okay, so a little bit about the differences between adult dragonflies and damselflies. When you're looking at them, the easiest thing by far is to notice how they're holding their wings. Damselflies hold them folded and at an angle that's kind of almost parallel to their abdomen, folded over their body and parallel. And dragonflies typically hold them mostly spread out to the sides of their bodies. They may alter the angle of that, especially if it's really hot day where they're trying to minimize their surface area and cool off, or vice versa on a colder morning. But generally, a dragonfly holds them out. There are a couple of other differences if you looked up close, but that's the main thing. If you notice, these are both roughly in the same position. the kind of angle of the thorax here is a little bit more upright, whereas the angle of the thorax here is pointing back, and that translates out to the wings. So, you know, if you're just seeing them hanging out, perched, that's the easiest thing to tell. Generally, dragonflies are larger and more robust. Damselflies are smaller, but there are some very, very small dragonflies and some larger damselflies. So kind of depends. As far as the larvae goes, we already talked about that, the external gills versus the internal gills, and some very rough size differences are one way to tell the difference. Actually, what else do I want to point out here? So their wings are amazing, and part of what contributes to making them successful long terms in terms of evolution. Now, most insects, after these kinds of wings evolved a way to fold their wings up and tuck them in. These things never got there. It works for them, but we know that folding the wings, so imagine a cockroach or a grasshopper or a beetle, that actually probably is much more successful for most of the winged insects. So they don't do that. And in fact, they have some differences internally in terms of how the muscles attach to the wings. These have what's called indirect flight. The muscles attach to the thorax, and the wings flap by the entire thorax. Remember, imagine looking at the thorax as a cylinder, and you're flexing that cylinder. That's what flaps the wings in dragonflies and damselflies. We call that indirect musculature. In all the other winged insects, the muscles attach directly to the wings and pull on the wings. And you might think, isn't that an inefficient way to fly? Well, my answer is 300 plus million years of evolution say otherwise. It works for them. The direct flight muscles work for all the other insects too. It's just a different system that worked itself out. As large visual predators, these things, if you look at their heads, are mostly eyeballs. They are active during the daytime, and they, compared to other insects, rely on their vision very, very heavily. They have among the most advanced visual systems. I have some colleagues who study the biochemistry and molecular evolution of the proteins that look at color and tell the difference between color. And they tell me that, and they publish, and that, you know, dragonflies have more diversity in those molecular mechanisms of vision than almost any other animal. It's fascinating. And consequently, they don't use their sense of smell anywhere near other insects. So they have very tiny hair-like antennae. Think about a moth that has big feathery antennae. They mostly are during the night. They're mostly using their sense of smell or chemistry. These things are active during the day, using their vision almost entirely. We know that they can smell things, but they don't rely on that very much. They do, as the adults, they do almost all of their prey capture entirely on the wing. And a study that came out a couple years ago showed that, at least under lab conditions, these things have a hunting capture success efficiency of around 90%, meaning of the prey that they see and that they decide they want to catch, they get about 90% of those. Now, if you think about a cheetah on the Serengeti or any other top predator, what do you think their success rate is? It's definitely lower, but any guesses? 45, 25. It's around 25, 30%. So top predators don't get anywhere near as good in terms of efficiency as these things do. And, you know, I don't have time to go over everything I know about dragonflies, but if you want to look up videos and the research on that, it kind of made a lot of headlines when it came out a couple of years ago. And there are cool videos showing them how efficient they are at capturing. They've looked at the neurobiology of how that works, how they're controlling their wings as they anticipate not only where a fly is, but where it's going to be. And it's just mind-blowing. 90% efficiency. Yeah, so they got really good eyes. And those legs of theirs, they mostly use them to perch and to capture prey. If you look up closer, you'll see there's big stiff bristles that almost look like spikes on their legs. Those are just for grabbing and holding on to prey and munching on them while they're flying around looking for the next prey item. And you can also see on these figures big, large thorax, almost entirely full of muscle on the inside to power those wings. That's true of a lot of insects, but abdomen then internally is mostly your digestive and reproductive structures. Okay, one of the most fascinating things about the nymphs or larvae of these animals is their mouth parts and the way their mouth parts are modified. So these have mandibles, which are basically teeth on the side of their heads that chew sideways like this. Now, that's true for a lot of insects, not all of them. Insects have mouth parts of the piercing and sucking type, or the like a butterfly or a moth that drinks nectar from a very deep flower with a deep corolla. These things have mandibulate mouth parts that also have a bottom lip that is like a giant grasping knife bearing hand. So it's kind of up against their face when they're not using it, and then they can shoot it out and grab their prey. What you see here is, I think, an Eschnid larva that has grabbed a small fish with that mouth part. And so we don't know, we haven't measured the efficiency of the larvae in water at hunting, but I bet it's pretty high. I don't know if it's 90%, but I'm sure it's pretty high. They're fascinating animals in both the juvenile and the adult form. And no other insect has anything remotely like that we know of. Good question. How much do they need to eat? Well, I can't answer that directly, but based on my knowledge of insects in general, when they are juveniles, they have to eat an awful lot. They're building up muscle. They're getting their body ready for this transformation that has to occur, and they're growing by a very large amount. Their body size throughout their lifetime grows way more than a mammal or a reptile does. And then as an adult, they have to fuel flight. It takes an awful lot of metabolic activity, an awful lot of energy. So they are mostly eating all day, every day, from what I can observe, from when it's warm enough for them to be active in the morning to about dusk, during the summer months anyway. But that also leads me to another point of how long do they live, and how long are they in the larval stage building up these reserves versus the adult? Well, that's going to depend a lot on where in the world they are, because these are what we would say are cold-blooded or exothermic animals. So their metabolic rates are entirely dependent on the external temperature. So in a place like this, where we are, near subtropic, you can get a couple of generations in a year. So a damselfly might have 2 or 3 generations a year. So that suggests that they're living in the juvenile stage for just a couple of months, and then the adult stage for just a couple of weeks. Juveniles hatched early spring will be mating in early summer, laying eggs. Those eggs will then hatch late summer, and so on and so forth. Now, if you're down in the tropics, where there's less fluctuation seasonally, they might go year round, have 3 or 4 generations a year. You go to northern latitudes where it's much colder, they might only have a single generation a year. And then some of the larger species, larger darners and things like this, which I'll talk about in a minute, they might live for 2 years in the juvenile stage. But in the adult stage, generally, you're talking about a couple of weeks only. So that's longer than many insects, but it's shorter than some. Well, again, within even the same species, this is going to depend on where they live, but anywhere from a couple of months, 2 or 3 months, to 6 or 7 months, or 2 or 3 years if you're talking about much colder places. And the same species can vary depending on what latitude it's at. Does that make sense? By the way, that's true for pretty much all insects anyway. Okay, another one. You're going to be quizzed on this in just a few minutes. No, the phylogeny of odonates is something that's fascinated me. Phylogenetics, I don't know how much you guys learn about this as Texas Master Naturalists, or how much you hear about it. It's highly complicated, but like any scientific study, these are a hypothesis that are based on data that we have. They change over time. And why would this be relevant to somebody interested in natural history? Well, we try and make classification based on phylogeny. Sometimes the phylogeny will change when we get new information, which means sometimes classifications change. That's in a nutshell, what I would say to a general group about phylogenetics. Good question. So again, that will depend largely on what latitude they're at. But around here, they are mostly going to overwinter as either eggs or larvae, but usually eggs. And I should say I know more about damselflies than dragonflies, which are smaller bodied and more susceptible to environmental change. So I want to say eggs mostly, but I'm not 100% sure. Not adults, though. You don't see adults doing anything really. I mean, we're about at the end of a lot of the activity for the year of adults. Okay, so the phylogeny, don't have to know or see or read any of this, but we do know that we have real good separation between what we say are the two suborders, the damselflies, the Zygoptera, and the dragonflies are what you see here. And then the levels that are illustrated here are family levels. So a lot of entomologists, there's so many insects, we can't possibly be experts in all of them or even many of them at all. And so many of us will learn things to the level of families. Those are levels of taxonomy that are generally easy to differentiate by eye. And then some of us are experts on a few more species within one of those families that we study. Here in the hill country, we have pretty good diversity of many insects, of course, many organisms, I should say. We know we have kind of the crossroads of many different biotic provinces. We're about at a transition between temperate and subtropic latitudes. And so lots of high diversity here. And of course, we're located geographically in a place where lots of things that do move north and south go right through this part of the world. So we are lucky to have pretty good dragonfly and damselfly diversity compared to the rest of the U.S. anyway. And this is just a rough breakdown of the numbers of species that I counted when I was just throwing this slide together today. As with anything, these are estimates. They're subject to change. We can always find new records. We always don't know whether when we find new specimens, they represent a real breeding population or an errant thing that's flown in from weather or something like that. And of course, keep in mind that these numbers may change as global climate change and various other factors continue. And those of us who study insects, you know, that's a double-edged sword. That could mean that we get some new cool species that are expanding their range north and we get to see them. But of course, what does that mean for the globe? It's hard to say. That's could be a bad thing. Anyway, keep that in mind. No, I'm just going to give you a highlight of a few things that I have found recently from around here. So these two species in the same genus represent the family Calopterigidae. By the way, pronunciation, I tell my students, I'm one of those professors that's maybe a little bit weird, but I don't really care how you pronounce it because I'm pretty sure I'm not pronouncing it right anyway. Somebody else in the world pronounces it differently. I say Calopterigidae. These are called broad-winged damselflies, and that's because the base of the wing near where it connects to the thorax is broader in comparison to some of the other families that I'll show you. And in this part of the country, which also keep in mind, people define the hill country differently. What is it, about 20 counties or so, depending on who you look at. The state of Texas is so big that if I was talking about Texas odonates, there would be a lot more species. So I'm just kind of focusing for now on ones that I know are relatively common in the hill country. And here you have these two species of Heterina. We may have a third. There was I have a colleague in Mexico that just described another species of Heterina, and she hasn't even looked at all the specimens from around the range to know whether or not we may have another species here. There's another common genus if you go just a little bit further east, towards East Texas, of jewel wings, which are in this family. These are beautiful, and they have a unique behavior that's very different from the ones that I study mostly. These are some of the ones that have territoriality. And so when you see these things on the stream, they usually don't stray very far from where they are protecting nice habitat, the males are trying to attract females to come over to them and say, hey, we've got a good place to lay eggs here. Please mate with me. Oh, I should also say that in almost all these things, the males are the ones that are more colorful and showy and tend to hang out closer to the water. During the heat of the day, the females are often spreading a little bit farther away from the water, hunting to get protein through her diet to make more eggs. Males, they kind of hang around waiting for them to come back then to the water and mate. In this case, though, they're protecting territory. Here's one of our. Oh, sorry, I just can't see. There it is. This is one of our lestids, which are called spread wing damselflies. They are a slight exception to the whole wing folding thing. These are damselflies that almost always hold their wings kind of at an angle. They're not fully flat. They're not fully closed over their back, excuse me, when they land. And this is a very large damselfly. These also tend to be more on pond and non-flowing waters, and so we don't have all that many species around here. This is one of the members of the family Protonuridae, which I would say is fairly distinctive hill country, at least, or Texas, at least as far as the U.S. goes. This is about the northern margin of their range, so almost, I don't know if very few other states, at least, have this family of damselfly in them. I got this just south of town a couple of weeks ago. This is Protonuricara, and these are called threadtails. The family Protonuridae are threadtails, just because they are very, very dainty, and they tend to have a much longer abdomen relative to their body compared to other damselflies. And I think they're just fascinating and beautiful. They're not super, super common around here, but if you look carefully, you can find them. Now, I did my dissertation work creating a phylogenetic tree of this genus of damselfly, which is in the family Cnagrionidae or Conagrionidae, depending on how you pronounce it. And this is the genus Argia. So I'm biased, but these are my favorite. The reason I chose to work on these is because they're fairly common. There are over 100 species in this genus. So for a genus of damselflies, they're one of the most speciose. They're relatively easy to collect, relatively easy to identify, and nobody had really worked on them in terms of their evolutionary relationship. So I decided to. In hindsight, I'm still not sure if that was a good idea or not, but I certainly have learned a lot. These tend to be bluish and violet, purple. And again, this is an extremely common genus. These are all extremely common species around here. And you go anywhere near a river or a stream where there's flowing water, and you're going to find these. So these are just a few of them. Now, one of the things that fascinated me about this genus not only is the number of species, but you have some species with extremely small and limited ranges, and others, like you see here, Argia translata, which is found across the entire country practically, and into Mexico or sometimes Canada, depending on how far north they go. So one of the questions I was interested for my dissertation is, well, why are there some species that are so widespread in the same genus? Biologically, as far as we can tell, they're doing the same thing in the environment, but others are very, very limited in their distribution. And those are really hard questions to ask, especially because you can't necessarily throw radio collars on them or follow them around for their whole lives and see exactly where they go and where they move. And again, I'll get back to that when I switch over to my current research. But I think they're beautiful, fascinating animals. Here's a few other genera of Cnagrionidae, which are extremely common and in some cases very widespread. And again, compared to the broad-winged damselflies, they have a very narrow petiole, or constriction of the wing, right where it connects to the thorax. Switching over to dragonflies, again, I can't possibly get them all in here. I've just got a few of recent photos that I took. These are representatives of the family Gomphidae, sometimes called clubtails. As you can see very easily when they're flying or perched, they have this broad elongation of their terminal abdominal segments, which looks like a club. These are I think, among dragonflies, the most diverse in terms of species that we have in Texas. Um, Now, worldwide, the family Libellulidae or Libellulidae um, have the most species. And here's two species that we have around here in the genus Libellula or Libellula. In fact, in French and Spanish, the word for dragonfly is derived from Libellula. Again, pardon my pronunciation. And I think these are fascinating animals and just wonderful. This is one of my favorite species, Libellula comanche, because the Comanche skimmer. It is not found too far north or of here, and I would say it represents a good Texas species, although it's in a few other states and Mexico. But that name is just really cool, and I think representative of our region. You can find these all up and down the Guadalupe around here. Okay, so I'm going to switch to my research, but any general biology of dragonfly questions before I switch to the research stuff? Are they all the same color, or are the colors characteristic of species and families? So no, they are not all the same color, and yes, their colors can be characteristic. Um, it's more about the patterns of colors in terms of identifying them at the species level, if you can do that. Now, there are some species that are very similar color patterned, but if you look at these, for example, and you got to also remember that with photography, the lighting makes a difference and the computer screen makes a difference to how they appear and all that kind of stuff. But on top of that, these things can ever so slightly change color with temperature throughout the day. And some of them, kind of like you see here, will secrete a waxy substance that goes on top of their exoskeleton, which also changes their color appearance from what the underlying exoskeleton is. And that can vary with age. But generally, it's about patterns of coloration. And so in the genus Argia, these are all called dancers, by the way. Um, you can see that a lot of what we do, if we can tell the difference, it's about the pattern of light color, which is usually the blue or the purple, compared to the dark coloration. And so if you look at the abdomen, you can see this one's mostly light for each abdominal segment, except the very end of the abdominal segment where you have a black ring. And then the pattern and thickness of the dark stripes on their thorax and things like that. So, does that answer your question? And there are some colors that you will see in some families or genera, but not in others. Sorry. There's one in the back, I think was first. Oh, that's a good question. So, within a given area or habitat that you're observing, what kinds of interactions between dragonflies and damselflies will you see? Well, a lot of it is a mixture of territoriality where different species are chasing each other off. Some species will patrol up and down the margins of a stream. By the way, I spend almost all my time on streams and rivers. Some of what I'm saying is different for ponds and lakes. Um, but some of them will patrol up and down the margin, and they're just sort of engaging in combat that you know is territorial of nature, or maybe they're inspecting each other. Are you part of my species or not? Things like that. And so it's a lot of aerial. I would describe it as aerial dancing around, and then alternating between moving back and forth. Almost all of them, if you see them perching, they will tend to fly away for little bits of time and then come back to a perch in the same very general area or even in the same area. When I'm trying to take pictures of them, if I scare one away, I often will just stop and wait and they'll come right back. Um Briefly, that's how I would answer that. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so what you see here on this species, the pterostigma is this darkened area that is out towards the tip and the front margin of their wings. And many species have some version of that. Here you can kind of faintly see it. It's not entirely in focus there. Um, And last I checked, we don't really know what that's about, although the suspicion is that it might add just a so it's probably pigment as well as maybe a little bit more cuticle, and it might add some weight that's used in aerodynamics. When you look at these things under slow motion photography, which again, just Google it, there's great stuff out there now with better cameras. The way that the wings flex in flight is just amazing, and we've only fairly recently been able to capture that in video. But yeah, that little bit of weight may be something for balance or helping them maneuver. Is that Tony? Tony, it's been a while. Oh, good question. Yeah, that one caught me off guard recently. Um, yeah, that's Argia plana. And this is an example of where taxonomists and phylogeneticists have gone through the records, looked at the data, and decided in this case that a species we used to call Argia plana actually was described by somebody for a species that had already been described somewhere else in the world. And the literature or the rules of nomenclature say that the first one wins. And so I don't know when that came out, but it was within the past couple of years, I think. So yeah, taxonomy changes, and we don't do it to make your lives more difficult, even though that's sometimes an outcome. We do it to try and reflect what we know about evolution. Another So again, just for those on Zoom and for recording, person here has a dead dragonfly that they've had for about 6 months with no apparent change whatsoever to its body. Yeah, well, that's because of the wonderful chemistry that evolved that makes the exoskeleton. It is a substance that is extremely durable and not subject to decay. Now, so there's internal soft parts, muscle and guts of all these insects, and those will decay, but there's not a lot of it, so it tends to either dry out and mummify or decay very quickly. But then the exoskeleton usually is not going to have any alterations except for under two conditions. One, there are things called dermestid beetles. They're the same things that eat skin and leather and hair and dandruff and whatnot of any animal, and they will eat dead insect parts. And the other is, well, of course, you could crush it. Um, some color that is embedded into the exoskeleton can fade over time because the color is pigments, which are different chemicals, which may have different sensitivities to time and humidity and things like that. But a well-preserved insect can remain unchanged for hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, natural history museums have insect specimens that are perfectly valid, useful. And I should say, when I did my graduate work and my postdoc work, this kind of biology, systematics, evolution, taxonomy, is usually done out of an insect museum. So the universities have big insect museums, and I would just go through those specimens sometimes, and hundreds of years old, and we can learn an awful lot about life today from those specimens because they don't change much. So yeah, if you keep it to where dermestid beetles can't get to it, it could last you forever. Kitchen window, well, that depends on how good your windows are. Then we could get into a whole thing on dermestid beetles. We don't have enough time. Okay, so what is the purpose of the different coloration on the wings and the bodies and whatnot? So probably the most general answer is species recognition, and probably more particular, are you a member of the opposite sex of my species? Anything, just like with birds and butterflies, where you have a difference between males and females, which I didn't really point out all that much, these do, um, sexual differences. So they're visual, and so that's not just useful for predation, that's also useful for finding mates. And again, there are some species that are very similar that we think even the damselflies or dragonflies themselves can't tell apart. And then they have other cues. But very broadly, they're probably looking at color patterns and going, you're one of me or not. Okay, let me get into my research a little bit. And again, I already kind of hinted at this, but this is another view of a previous picture that I took showing you just dozens of members of the same exact species, males guarding females after copulation as they are laying eggs in a piece of driftwood, which is precariously lodged on a rock. But any movement of water, rains, I don't know, a kid kicking the log, and this thing is gone. And who knows where it's going to end up. And what it's taking with it is all the genes that are in the population of the species and depositing them somewhere else. This fascinates me. There's just a little bit of a close up there. And the reason it fascinates me is because when we talk about populations, which are the unit of evolution, populations make up species, so on and so forth. For a vast majority of organisms, we don't know where those populations start and stop. We do with certain large animals that we can observe directly and track over time, somewhat reasonably. But for most insects that fly around, we don't know where their margins and boundaries of a population is. And these are a couple of options. For you could have one big population, a couple of small ones, and then the arrows on this one are also indicating, well, how often do populations make contact with each other through individuals moving into or out of a population and then mating, which is how we define gene flow. Gene flow is what holds species together. A lack of gene flow, very generally, is what makes populations drift apart into new species. So if we think this happens, but we can't observe it, then we're just guessing. Is this part of the same population as what I saw downstream or in a different river or what? And that is kind of the hypotheses that I decided to try and test. So this is a map showing you some of our South Texas watersheds with that idea that I just explained kind of overlapped. Are different colors and shapes of these things representing population differences. Where does one population start? Where does one population end? This is one possibility. Keep in mind that the larvae are in the water and they can move around in that water, but they're tiny. They're probably not moving very far. So what might move a larva in the water very far? A log. Well, that would specifically be eggs, but yes, that would move them. The current. And then that current would get a lot stronger if there's floods, rains, things like that, right? So, and then what about the adults? The adults can fly. How far do they fly? It's not necessarily a matter of how far can they fly, because we know that occasionally things can fly really far, but how far do they? So this is one possibility. There's some geographic distance that defines where a population starts and stops. Or maybe it's simply a watershed difference. This would suggest that populations aren't flying between watersheds very much. And we just don't know for these animals. And by the way, we don't know this for most aquatic insects or aquatic organisms in general that are small. Or maybe you have some intermediate stage again. And so these kinds of questions are what I was interested in asking. Now, again, I won't get into a lot of details about the theory here, but if geographic distance is the main thing that separates populations, well, if you look at where I've drawn the arrows here, there are some parts of our South Texas rivers which are closer to other parts of another river. So if but the larvae can't move between rivers, at least not without some help. But the adults could. So can we tease that apart from a situation, again, where they're simply remaining faithful to their river that they were born in? Mostly they're not flying very far, and mostly any long distance movement is in the larvae by chance, by the currents, by floods, whatever. And part of my inspiration for this was going back to a paper that, I did my PhD at Ohio State. It wasn't because of this person, but by chance I had found this paper. Donald Bohr is a famous entomologist in general, wrote one of the most widely used textbooks of entomology. And it happens that in 1934, he studied Argia moesta, one of our very widespread species, by mark, release, recapture. So one cool thing about their wings and the strength of their exoskeleton is you can just capture a bunch of them, write a number on their wings with a marker, release them, and then see what happens. And he did that in 1934, which, you know, at the time that was high tech, I guess. And he showed that for this species, by the way, this Argia moesta, again, is extremely widespread across North America. It's everywhere. But he found that individuals tend to not fly in their lifetime more than about 200 yards. Now, I'm talking about a specific species of damselfly. There are dragonflies which migrate across continents. So I'm not talking about those. My research is focusing on these things that apparently don't fly very far. And so I wanted to test some of these hypotheses. Despite how far can they move, how far do they move? And how much of it is entirely in the larva stage? How much does the adult stage contribute? And how much of it is just isolation by distance versus something else? Now, any population of a sexually reproducing species, individuals are more likely to find a mate in an area that is very close to them, generally speaking. Large migratory birds perhaps are an exception. Fishes that move across oceans perhaps are an exception. But generally, you're going to find a mate close to where you are. That's even true for humans. Mostly, I guess if you're doing internet dating, maybe not. Okay, so then here's the other thing about this that I think is fascinating and timely and whatnot is, well, what about disturbances to these ecosystems, and what role might they contribute to either slowing down the movement of genes through individuals migrating and moving, or maybe increasing that? Okay, so what slows down the flow of water in a river? We got any issues with that stuff around here? Dams. We got people trying to build dams all over the place. It's not necessarily in the best interest of nature, to say the least. We still don't know even things like bridges or things that might divert flow or form bottlenecks in the river. We don't know what role they might play in either increasing movement of these aquatic species or hampering it. Of course, human activity. I had this idea that, you know, maybe in places where you get hundreds and hundreds of college kids hanging out in the river, does that have any effect on these things? I don't know. And then the natural stuff of drought and flood cycles, which, you know, at least as far as I'm aware around here, we've got these sort of 10, 15-ish year cycles. And can we understand something about that within the career of a scientist? So what I've been doing is, for now, I don't know, 7 or 8 years since I got back to Texas, trying to collect specimens from various parts of the river, preserve them for DNA analysis, and do that year after year to build up the kind of database that we would need to answer these questions, particularly about long-term changes, and how that might change organismal population boundaries. So I do a lot of field work, natural history, and a combination of lab work looking at DNA, because at least we haven't found a good, cheap way to get GPS tags and radio transmitters on tiny, tiny damselflies. They are doing it for dragonflies, by the way, some big dragonflies. It's a little easier to look at the genetics of a population, sample some DNA. You don't sample all the DNA. You just look at a gene or two, maybe 3 or 4, from a few specimens from one population, compare them to the other. And so myself and my students, we go through these processes to get DNA, sequence it, and then compare it. And that is the collecting part of it is one of my favorite parts. It's part of why I really focused on Odonata too, is I like going out on a nice summer day and being, you know, waist deep in the water. So I'm not hot. I don't have to worry about stepping on rattlesnakes, things like that. And I don't have to be out all night like the people who study beetles and moths. I like to sleep. So I've done this with students, by myself, with my now 13-year-old, and in various classes. And I've tried to get students, at a school like Schreiner, we don't have a lot of research resources, and I don't have time. We're a school where most of the professors teach a full load. We don't have a lot of time to do research. So I've tried to figure out ways to incorporate this into my classes. So I get my classes doing that. Sometimes I teach genetics lab. I have them doing my damselflies to get that DNA out and stuff like that, and learn about genetics broadly. By the way, most of our students in biology over here at Schreiner, they want to be doctors and vets, and that's understanding. There's nothing wrong with that, but um, I try and explain to them that doing research like this is teaching them about these basic things that will help them if they get into vet school and medical school and stuff. Um, I have a few students that really are interested in this, and for them, we can do independent research projects and things like that. And they can sometimes generate enough data to do a thesis on this, even as undergrads. Um, and there's a couple of other courses that we teach and skills that are involved in this kind of research that I work on. There's some statistics involved in analyzing these data, broad evolution and ecology questions, not just focused on damselflies that we can use this for. So again, we go in this case, the Guadalupe is easiest and what we've focused on the most so far. We go up and down, and we're making a hypothesis that every place we stop and collect could be a different population. And we're limited to where the roads cross the river mostly because it's privately owned. Every now and then I'll meet a private landowner who will let me get on their land, and if that applies to any of you, I have business cards. I'd love to get on your land and collect insects and bring students out and stuff. But they love it certainly too. Then back in the lab, we're doing DNA extractions and various ways to check for what genes that we're measuring. We want to make sure we measure the same genes in every population for every species. And by the way, I think I have it up here. Yeah, we focus on species that are fairly common because we want to make sure we have samples from everywhere we go. And we're eventually expanding. Well, we've started expanding this to other rivers in the area. We're not just focusing on the Guadalupe. That's just the one we have the best samples from. So the common species, but it's not just one species. So when we're comparing one population to another, it's the same species. But we actually want to see if this holds true for many different species that have similar biologies, because they might not. And of course, we also have to choose some of our research focus on specimens that are widely available from outside of our region to serve as a comparison point. Whenever you're doing any kind of comparative biology, you got to have something to compare it to. So we do some of the lab work and molecular and genetic work here at our labs at Schreiner, but we don't have a lot of the more expensive equipment, in particular the DNA sequencers. Last time I checked, those cost about $500,000 each. So we send ours off to a company or another university that has those resources. And then nowadays we can just get, through modern internet and bioinformatics, the data sent back to us overnight after we send them the samples. And then there's all kinds of software involved in editing it. There's some basic principles of how molecules evolve that I have to teach the students. So again, it's a good lesson that's general. It's not just about damselfly biology when we do this. And this presentation is a couple years old, so I'll just skip to where we are at that time. So again, this is looking just at Argia moesta, one of the most widespread species. And all this shows you is that when we sample populations of this species from up and down the Guadalupe River, they are extremely genetically similar. Almost no measurable difference. Statistically, these are not different numbers. Similarly, when we look at a tree of populations now, this is not different species, these are all the populations, we do see evidence in this preliminary study that distance is what defines their population boundaries, not movements upriver or anything like that. So preliminarily, we say this supports the hypothesis that maybe within a single watershed, they're all the same species, which isn't all that surprising. We haven't gotten the data sampled yet at a fine enough scale to know what about dams, but we hope to do that soon. So we see similar patterns in other species that we look at. And again, you don't have to know anything or be able to read any of this to know that what we're looking at here is extreme genetic similarity among populations for all the species that we've sampled so far, suggesting again that it's watersheds, not smaller geographic areas that define population boundaries. And again, we do see some evidence that they're directional in that near the headwaters, we see populations that have a ever so slightly different genetics, but down away from that, they become more and more similar, which again suggests that populations are mostly moving in the larval or egg stage downstream as opposed to flying back upstream. But as with any good research, we need more data. Okay, so lots and lots of students are involved in this, and students graduate, I keep my job, and so many of these students have now gone on to medical school or graduate school or dental school in some cases. Some of them have jobs in environmental careers, which I'm very proud of. And I have students here now working on this. They kind of pick up from where the last student left off when they're working with me very closely for multiple semesters. So going to the research, any questions about that or anything that's on your mind? I don't know how I'm doing on time. When are we supposed to be done? Oh, okay. We went over. You guys are a good audience. Now, you probably know this, but my students today, they can't keep their heads up for 5 minutes in a lecture like this. So this is amazing. I lost track of time because y'all are all looking at me and interacting with me. Anyway, if you got to wrap this up, I can hang around, or if we have time for more questions here. So the question is it that dragonflies migrate and damselflies don't? It's actually much more fine scale than that. Very few species of dragonflies appear to. But even their close relatives, animals with similar body size and behavior and all that, don't. So the common green darner, one of our big giant dragonflies that flies around ponds all around here, that at least in some parts of the world appears to migrate. And there's a few other species. I don't have Pantala or Tramia. Those are ones that might migrate, or at least certain populations of them might migrate. And so again, there are some people studying that. These are big dragonflies, right? So there are some radio tags or GPS tags or something, that trackers that they can glue onto those animals, and they've tried to do that. But it's very few species in terms of the 5,000 or so in the entire order. So so you saw a cluster of dragonflies that looked like they were maybe all doing something at once and maybe moving. Yeah. So that could be a couple of different things, but migration is, I don't remember the exact definition, but it's basically a movement of animals of the same population, same species, in a direction for a given reason. And so when you see a lot of them swarming around, that's not necessarily them moving in a different direction. When you see a bunch of them swarming, that could just be a good place for food. So I see that all the time. I've got a kid in soccer fields. You'll see no, so many of them, or whenever they mow the lawn at Schreiner, a big lawn like that. Well, that's because they've got a lot of food that's been kicked up. That's not necessarily them all moving in a long distance way together. Yeah. Yeah, lots of flies will usually, when the weather's good, mean lots of dragonflies. Yeah, great question. So, building artificial habitat, even just tiny, tiny ponds in your yard, or supporting that in the community, will get you some aquatic insects, including dragonflies and damselflies. Now, you got to be careful because that's also going to bring mosquitoes in, but I'm sure many of you know about that as much or more than me. Um, but if you get the dragonflies and damselflies in there that like pond habitats, that's very, very easy to do. Now, many species of both dragonflies and damselflies really prefer moving water, and it's kind of hard to build an artificial stream, as far as I know. I think that would be quite an endeavor. However, supporting the health of stream ecosystems, supporting agendas and things that maintain the health of the stream is generally going to help not only dragonflies and damselflies, but everything else that relies on them, everything else that's aquatic. So, you know, I only recently got a little bit more active in some local groups that are working on protecting water resources here in Kerr, because apparently we don't have as many active groups. And, so I've started paying attention, and this thing that's in the national news about the attempted dam that's being built. What is it, on the Llano? Um, it's really hard to say that it is entirely all bad for biology, but I have a very strong feeling that it's not really good for any stream organism to build a dam like that. So I guess I should be careful about being political and economic here, but okay. So the question is, are populations declining of dragonflies and damselflies because you have observed that? And I would say it certainly is possible. There is research worldwide that shows insects in general are declining. Um, However, you got to take all that with a grain of salt. No, research is rarely definitive, and it depends on where you study that and how you study it and all that kind of stuff. I will say that with some of these things that I've observed most, which is again certain damselflies, there will be years where on a stretch of river you don't see them, and then they come back better than ever. So they are susceptible to these changes that may not mean they're in trouble. It may just be seasonal variation, ever slow, so slight variation in the water chemistry or the water flow or something like that, and not necessarily permanent when you see a decline from one year to the next. But, you know, I think as people who are conservation minded, you want to err on the side of caution and take notice, be aware, make notes, talk to people. I think raising awareness about the potential for them to decline is very serious. And again, as I said in the beginning, we might see some cool new species here that are moving their ranges northward, but that may not be a good sign that the environment is healthy. So even if you see more insects, is that really a good thing? Kind of depends. All right, I will hang out if you have any more questions. I will make my contact information available if anybody on Zoom wants to get in contact with me. Somebody here will have that information.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. Thank you very much. And let's give him a big hand again. Thank you.